Diana slept peacefully at the castle. The strong air, which seemed cool and vivifying even on the hottest day, made her sleepy. The old caretaker bustled about, anxious to please her, and insisted on her eating the simple meals he brought her, so hurt when she returned a dish he had prepared for her untouched that to please him she would eat, even though she was not hungry. The food was delicious, and Diana was aware that most of it came from Huntsman's house, but it was added to by a dish or two from the old caretaker's little kitchen, and though she would not wound his feelings by refusing. It was the first time in her life she had ever been alone, and the first night she lay awake, watching the stars, for she had left her windows uncurtained, listening to the gentle rustling of the trees in the night wind. She had stood for a long time at her window before she went to bed, and the quiet of the night and the vastness of the valley had brought peace to her mind. She felt calmer, less afraid, more prepared to think and face calmly within herself what she was to do. Song of The next day had brought sunshine and the birds very early in the morning, and she had walked over 74 the hills until she was utterly tired, and had spent the night in a sleep, dreamless, and bringing her renewed energy. There was a sweet note on her breakfast table from Lolia, saying that they were longing to see her when she felt ready to meet them, but to stay as long as she liked, and to do exactly as she wished. And so 2 or 3 days passed uneventfully, bringing health and strength and color again to her cheeks, but bringing also the question of what she was to do more and more vividly to her mind. Her education, Diana decided, extensive though it had been, and certainly most expensive, had fitted her in no way for earning money. She could speak several languages conversationally well enough to travel and talk adequately with foreigners, but she did not know the grammar well enough to teach them. She could drive a car, but she had little or no idea of its internal mechanism. She could ride perfectly, but had never groomed a horse in her life. She could dance very well with a partner, but she could not have shown anyone an intricate step. She doubted even her ability to become a shop girl, having bought all her life, and never sold anything, not even at a local bazaar. She laughed now when she thought how often she had been described as accomplished, as talented, as brilliant, a full quota of attraction which could not assure her of getting a job at £1 a week. After she had been in the castle for nearly 5 days, she received a letter from Jimmy. TV got a job, he wrote, in a garage in Chelsea. It was an extraordinary bit of luck, as the proprietor was at Eton with me, in fact I fagged for him. He's a good fellow, and has taken me on the condition I change my name. And so, dear sister, exit Sir James Headley, Bart, and enter into trade Jimmy Marlowe, garage mechanic. P.S. You should see me in overalls. Diana felt envious of Jimmy's high spirits, and his capacity for laughing, whatever happened, and she wrote back wishing him luck, and promising she would do her best to be as clever as he had been. Sitting down with a pencil and paper, she tried to do accounts as to how she was to spend her £125 a year to its best advantage, but as she had no idea of the cost of living, or where she could live or find a room cheaply, she found her calculations at the end of an hour or so unconstructive. It seemed to her impossible that anyone could live on such a small sum, and were her earnings to be £2 or £3 a week, she had no idea how to handle so little money to the best advantage. She suddenly picked up the paper, tore it up, and burst into tears. It all seemed so completely hopeless, and within the confidence she had always held in herself tumbled her inadequacy to find a solution. Her self-respect vanished, and fell. She sat in her chair, her face in her hands, tears trickling through her fingers. She made no attempt to stop crying, abandoning herself to her own control. She was in despair, and for the first time for years she was really natural. The life she had lived had never allowed her to be completely unaffected by her surroundings. Even in the privacy of her bedroom at Park Lane, or in the country, there was her maid near at hand, ready to enter should she make the slightest unusual sound. There was her face to be thought of should she cry and damage her complexion, which must be stared at in a few hours by numerous acquaintances. People everywhere, servants to her money as she had been herself, slaves to a luxury which denies one thing, and that the intimacy of solitude. It was nearly an hour before she finally stopped crying, and her sobs quietened. She wiped her swollen eyes, and somehow, though exhausted by her tears, she felt they had washed away a burden from her mind, a depression which had been like an ominous thunder cloud, promising to break. She bathed her eyes, feeling the cool malevolent water soothe her hot skin, and then she ran down the stone stairs and on to the hill. The afternoon was advancing, the sun was high and very hot. She walked a little way from the castle, and sat down on a fallen tree trunk, and gazed over the country before her, and then a footfall behind her made her start. She turned and saw Barry Dunbar coming up the footpath which led from Huntsman's house. Diana jumped to her feet, as if she would escape, and stood irresolute, realizing it was too late. Barry came forward smiling, and shook her hand. "Miss Headley," he exclaimed, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I am staying at the castle," Diana said. "I am sorry if I am disturbing you," he said. I had no idea there was anyone up here, but I called at the house to find Lolia and Jack had gone to a cricket match, and I particularly wanted some papers that I left in the desk, and thought I would come up and fetch them myself. That's quite all right, Diana said. Please fetch them if you want them. I haven't seen Lolia yet. She sat down on the log, and Barry, quite naturally without further words, sat down beside her. There was a silence between them for a moment, and then Barry put out his hand towards her. May I say I'm terribly sorry? He said. Diana put her hand in his, and then suddenly, to her own mortification, she felt the tears again springing to her eyes. She gazed in front of her, thinking to stop them from falling. Barry held her hand very tightly in his. He said, "You're all right. You have left the only thing that matters." "What is that?" Diana said wonderingly. "Courage," he answered. Then, as abruptly as he had come, he rose to his feet and left her. She sat quite still for a moment, feeling cheered. Barry had meant what he said. She knew that he had not made the remark merely as a gesture or out of a desire to sympathize. He had meant it, and somehow it mattered enormously that he should think of her in such a way. A minute or so later he came back, carrying a collection of papers under his arm. He came up beside her, and she looked at him. "Thank you," she said very simply. He took her hand again in his. "I know what has happened matters now," he said, "but it won't forever. Life is really just a tremendous adventure. Good things or bad things, they are all incidents by the wayside. The only thing that really matters is the real life underneath it all. And remember, you've always got that." He looked at the scenery around them as he spoke, and to Diana his words seemed to make it all the more vivid to her. The brilliance of the blue sky flecked with white clouds, the land, green or golden with corn, with its silvery rivers and dark verdant woods, took on a new richness. The trees directly below them, their leaves glittering in the sunlight, their trunks red gold or dark with clinging ivy, Diana realized their aliveness. The earth beneath her feet, vibrating with the power of growth, each blade of grass, each tiny tendril of emerald moss, everything was alive, part of herself as she was part of them. It was as if the knowledge of it came to her with the touch of Barry's hand, as though he opened her eyes to the new world, and showed her the beauty of true life unaffected by the machinery of cities or the vibrations of people. And when he had gone she sat on, feeling that he had brought her a new hope and a great comfort. He carried strength with him, she thought, a strength of personality as apparent as strength of arm was in some people. And, absurd though it might be, she felt that he was one of the few friends left to her, and that he was more real than anyone else she knew. The following morning brought her a letter which surprised her. It was from Mrs. Sknyber. "Dear Miss Headley, my husband and I would be so pleased if you would care to come to us as a companion to our daughter Ruth. I talked the idea over with Miss Carter and she thinks it is an excellent idea, as we would like to have you, and feel sure you would get on well with Ruth. We are prepared to offer you £200 a year, and of course all expenses. We are going abroad very shortly, and so would like to have your answer that you can accompany us. I do hope you will say yes. Yours sincerely, Esther Sknyber." A companion to Ruth Sknyber. Diana sat amazed at the idea. At the same time she thought how extremely kind it was of Mary Carter to have arranged this for her. Diana's first impulse was to refuse instantly, and then she realized that beggars could not be choosers. To companion Ruth Sknyber in London, to move on the outskirts of the society she had once ruled, to be subservient to the wills and whims of the Sknybers, with their good-humored vulgarity, was something she could hardly contemplate. Yet she knew, after her searching examination of herself that very day, that she was unfitted for anything else. The advantages were, of course, that she would have a roof over her head, and she knew the wage offered was an extraordinarily generous one. She would still live in luxury, she would still move in the world she knew so well, but with what a difference. Where she had queened it over her acquaintances, she would now be a paid servant, the dependent who must bend to the will of her employer. "I can't do it. I can't," Diana said to herself out loud, and then she saw Jimmy's letter lying on the table. He had given up everything, he was an ordinary hand in a garage. At least he has been able to change his name, she thought. What was she to do? All that day she thought and thought, veering between yes and no, circumstances compelling her to accept gratefully, and every inclination in her body fighting against it. "I can't bear it. I can't," she kept saying. A letter from Mary Carter arrived next day, a very charming, very sympathetic letter, but which told Diana as clearly as her own honesty that she thought her extremely fortunate to have obtained such an offer. "The Sknybers are going abroad for a little while," she wrote, "which will be an excellent thing, dear, because everyone will have forgotten by the time you get back. I am sure you will decide wisely, and accept, and the Sknybers are really nice people, and very easy to get on with. People would have forgotten Diana knew her own crowd so well except when they actually met her. Then they would shrug their shoulders and say, "Diana Headley, you know, daughter of the crook who shot himself," and pass on glibly to the next scandal. Oh, to be a man! She thought, to be able to change her name and go abroad, to go where no one knew her, to pick up a living, no matter how, even as a crossing sweeper, without having to face people who had known her before. If wishes were horses. Diana took up her pen and wrote and accepted the post of companion to Ruth Schneiber. A fortnight later she started her first job of work. Mrs. Schneiber was, she found, the most difficult one of the family to cope with. Ruth was good-humored, lazy, inclined to be envious, but on the whole so kind-hearted that one could not help liking her. Mr. Schneiber, who was too busy to be met except in the evening, when he returned tired, and inclined to irritability before he had had his food, treated her with a deference and a politeness which she appreciated amongst the diverse attitudes of the rest of the household. Mrs. Schneiber feared from over-familiarity to a querulousness as to whether she were worth the money they were paying her. Soon after her arrival, Diana became well aware that part of the inducement which Mary Carter had used to persuade Mrs. Schneiber to employ her was her close acquaintance with people in society the Schneibers wished to know. It was unfortunate from their point of view that the only thing Diana really wished to avoid was meeting any of her former friends. Her actual companionage did not seem for the first day or two a particularly arduous one. She accompanied Ruth shopping and did her best to prevent her purchasing the more garish and vulgar ornamentations which she desired, persuading her instead to dress herself in plain, well-cut garments which suited her somewhat statuesque good looks and hid a good deal of her obvious tendency to put on weight. After shopping, they lunched at the Ritz, or somewhere where Ruth thought she would see smart people. In the afternoon, they drove, went to a cinema, or went home, and Ruth had a quiet lie-down before the evening. The Schneibers were thoroughly oriental in one particular: they were either out of the house or in bed. They had no idea of sitting, talking or reading in the living rooms of their luxurious new home. Neither Mrs. Schneiber nor Ruth rose until late in the morning, and then they would dress themselves in their best clothes and go out. The instant they returned they would take off their clothes, with the true instinct of saving their best, and, putting on something more comfortable, lie down on their beds. Diana found this arrangement suited her, for she was then free to go to her own room, and read or write as the spirit moved her. What she found most difficult in the household was the attitude of the servants. She had never before encountered the extraordinary snobbery of that particular branch of workers. At first she was surprised at the rather condescending manner of the upper servants, which alternated with veiled impertinence from the younger ones. Like most people who have made money and risen to be able to afford a large household, the Schneibers were terrified of their own staff. They treated them by either bullying them or pleading with them for whatever they required. The butler, who was of the old school, was in reality an extraordinarily efficient man, but he utterly despised his new masters and made very little effort to hide his feelings. The rest of the household obviously took their cue from him. The worst of all, as far as Diana was concerned, was Mrs. Schneiber's lady's maid, who unfortunately had a young man who had lost a few pounds in the Headley crash. She treated Diana as a pariah from the moment she set foot in the house, and seldom missed an opportunity of making some pointed reference to her origin. If she happened to be in Mrs. Schneiber's room when she was dressing, the maid would ostentatiously lock up the jewelry, putting it away with a self-righteous air which was really too comical to distress her. The Schneibers as a whole were very kind to her, and it was not their fault that she should feel so utterly lost at being told to fetch and carry, to run upstairs for this or that, and at finding herself unable to express, when she wished, her likes and dislikes, or her inclinations. Mrs. Schneiber had a bitter, biting tongue when she chose, and being temperamental, if anyone was not as polite as she wished, she found a vent for her feelings in abusing them rudely for hours on end to her daughter and to Diana. The latter found it extremely difficult to refrain from making an impassioned defense of some of her former best friends whom she heard attacked in such a manner. She soon realized the uselessness of doing anything but agreeing with Mrs. Schneiber, who would stride up and down the room, her fat figure panting with fury, her numerous jewels rattling and clanking with her anger, as she asked, "And why should she not speak to me, I would like to know? Didn't I meet her only last week? Didn't I give £100 to her charity? And yet she passes me by. She is a dreadful woman, I tell you. Oh, yes, thinks that she can do as she likes, because her father was a duke. Well, I tell you, a good many people know of her goings-on with that good-looking agent of theirs. Oh, yes, a lot of people. Do you think that's a nice way to behave? And yet she dares to cut me, who have been respectable all my life. She is an improper woman, lady or no lady. There are some nice things said about her, and, what is more, I will give her no more of my money. Not one penny piece more shall she have. On and on the tirade would go, often over some quite imaginary slight, or perhaps a real one. For the people so sought after by Mrs. Schneiber had no compunction about taking large checks for their charities, flattering her and cajoling her at committee meetings into giving them her husband's hard-earned money, and looking through her smiling salutation should they meet her later on. Diana at times wondered whom she despised most, Mrs. Schneiber for her absurd snobbery, or the people who made use of their birth and position merely to take money from this silly, ambitious woman, and would not even repay her generosity by courtesy. Few of Diana's friends realized she had come back to London, and she was only a week with the Schneibers at their house in Grosvenor Square before they left for Monte Carlo. She had hoped that they would spend the summer quietly, but she was doomed to disappointment. The end of July saw them all packing feverishly after spending an exhausting time buying beach pajamas, bathing dresses, and yachting clothes for the South. In vain Diana protested that Mrs. Schneiber did not require a completely nautical outfit because they had bought a small yacht to use more or less as a glorified motorboat. Mrs. Schneiber insisted, and Diana's only relief when she arrived at Monte Carlo was that the yachting cap and the eye coat with its brass buttons were seldom worn, owing to the fact that both Mrs. Schneiber and Ruth felt violently sick even on the calmest sea. At Monte Carlo was the usual crowd of fat and thin women beginning to tan themselves to a good chocolate brown, and the inevitable collection of smarmy, mobile hip gigolos waiting like vultures for a rich prey, whatever her age or size. There were rich old men finding a senile satisfaction in watching young girls bathe and looking at the latest semi-naked cabaret. There were sleek, bored women showing the latest Parisian models and walking about disdainfully aware of the excitement their appearances were causing among their own sex. There were gamblers, clutching with bony, claw-like hands at every franc gained, gamblers who threw their mills on the table and pretended they were not watching the result, shrugging their shoulders when they lost. There were few unattached young men who could have been described as decent. Mrs. Schneiber soon discovered this, and her protests were loud and long at the state of civilization which did not provide hundreds of good-looking rich partis with whom Ruth might have become acquainted. "I've never seen such a poor lot," she said sitting beside the bathing pool, her spacious figure grotesquely draped in blue-spotted pajamas with an orange belt. She held her lorgnette, studded with diamonds, to her nose, and swept the assembly with a scornful stare. "Now tell me, Diana," she said, "if you see anyone you know or know about. There's that Lady Dashley, of course not a penny to her name, and yet she gets everywhere. I don't understand it, I don't really. It isn't as though she's good-looking enough to make anyone want to pay for her. Now, who's this man coming down the steps? I've seen him somewhere before." Diana looked where the fat jeweled finger indicated and saw, coming down the steps, assisting a tall blonde girl, Hugo. For a moment the blood rose to her face, and she felt herself flushing crimson. She opened her bag to find her handkerchief, and a moment later her hand was quite steady, and she had control of herself. Hugo and the blonde girl walked straight towards them. And as they passed their chairs he saw Diana. "Diana," he said with a cry, and held out both his hands. Diana managed quite a casual, "Hello, Hugo," and introduced them quickly to Mrs. Schneiber. Mrs. Schneiber was delighted. "Of course we've met before, Lord Dulk," she said. "I remember you well. I was just saying to Diana as I saw you coming down the steps, surely that's Lord Dulk, we've just arrived. Are you staying down here? You must come and meet my girl, and come on the yacht with us, we've got one here, just a small one, you know, for cruising about. I said to my husband, we don't need anything big, something small, so that we can have jolly little picnics. It's so lovely to get away from all the crowd. Don't you think so, Lord Dulk?" Hugo answered her politely, and then turned to Diana. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "With us," Mrs. Schneiber said before Diana could answer. "Why don't you come in to dinner tonight? It would be nice for you and Diana to talk over old times, and I'd like you to meet my daughter Ruth. I know she'd love to see you again." Hugo looked bewildered, but excused himself from accepting the invitation to dinner. "I'm afraid I'm engaged," he said, "but perhaps we shall meet at the casino afterwards." "Of course you are coming to gamble." "Of course," beamed Mrs. Schneiber. "I shall see you later then, Diana," he said, as his blonde lady made signs at him from some seat she had secured farther on beside the pool. "I want to see you particularly," he added in an undertone, and he hurried away. "Now, there's a nice young man," Mrs. Schneiber said. "I remember meeting him before at a dance we gave. I thought how good-looking he was at the time, and Mary Carter told me afterwards that he was considered a big catch. I wonder if he will do for Ruthie." "Very nicely, I should think," Diana said. "Oh well, we shall see him this evening," Mrs. Schneiber said. "I wonder what dress Ruth had better wear. I don't care much about those you bought her in London. Now Ruth always looks her best in cherry. I seldom dressed her in anything else as a child." Cherry velvet in the winter, and cherry satin in the summer. She looked a treat, I can tell you. People used to say to me, "You'll ruin your husband, Mrs. Kniber, spending all his money on the child's back." But I always said that Ruth paid for dressing. Oh well, here she comes. She broke off as Ruth came wandering towards them. Really, Diana thought, she looked very nice, in a plain, well-cut beach dress and a huge white linen hat shading her face. Ruth did not resent advice, and she had advised her to give up wearing the massive charm-bespangled bracelets of which she was so fond, and to leave off her rather too large pearls when she was in beach clothes. Completely jewelless, and without any garish trimmings, she was really handsome this morning. She walked a little self-consciously, but slowly, past the long rows of sunbathers to her mother's side. "Ruthie," Mrs. Kniber said excitedly, "who do you think we've just been talking to, and who particularly asked to see you at the casino tonight?" "Lord Dog. You remember him, don't you?" "Of course," Ruth replied, "but I don't suppose he particularly asked to see me. He's Diana's young man, you know." "Oh, no, he isn't," Diana said quickly. "Diana's young man?" echoed Mrs. Kniber. "Oh, yes, I remember now, you brought him to our party, didn't you, Diana?" "Oh, well, he said he'd like to see you tonight, Ruthie, and he didn't expect to see Diana here." "I expect." She stopped suddenly, but Diana could quite fill in what she had been going to say. She expected that since the crash he had not so much use for her as he had. It was better to face the truth, Diana thought. Thank God, she added in her mind, I don't have to pretend to myself. She got to her feet. "Do you mind if I just go back to the hotel?" she said. "I've forgotten something I want." Then she added, "I think I am well out of the running where Lord Dog is concerned, Mrs. Kniber, and I am quite certain he would love to meet Ruth again. Shall I order a table at the casino for dinner?" Mrs. Kniber nodded. "Yes, do," she said. "That's a good idea." Diana walked slowly back. It was too hot to hurry. The curve of the mountains high above Monte Carlo made a complete sun trap, and the heat in its intensity was almost oven-like. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the calm sea. It had given her a shock meeting Hugo again. It seemed so long ago that she had last seen him, when she had felt his good-night kiss and listened to his pleadings that he might come in for a moment. How glad she was that she had refused him. She felt now that she could not have borne to have flirted and laughed, perhaps even encouraged him, in a house where her father lay dead that night, which had changed the whole course of her life and altered her existence out of all recognition. She wondered what Hugo had to say to her so particularly. There was so little he could say. Yet somehow she was glad they had met again. She had dreaded it so much. She knew now she had been shrinking all the time from this meeting. In London, when out with Ruth, she had watched the doorway of every restaurant in spite of herself. Every other man to enter made her heart leap a little, thinking it was Hugo, finding a likeness to him in the turn of every man's head and the set of every man's shoulders. Now the much-dreaded meeting had happened. She had met him, and somehow the ordeal had not been as terrible as she had fancied. Almost lightheartedly she picked up her bag and her ride out of her room. As she turned the corner of the corridor towards the lift, she ran full tilt into someone approaching, a tall, good-looking young man, with fair hair and blue eyes, who, laughing at the force of impact, steadied her from falling with his hands on her arms. "I am so sorry," Diana apologized. "And so am I," he said. "No, on second thought, I'm not. I think this constitutes an introduction, don't you?" He smiled so good-humoredly at her that Diana could not help laughing. "Certainly not," she tried to say severely, but she was forced to smile back at him. He was so young and obviously full of life. She remembered seeing him last night in the distance at the casino, and she would not have been a woman if she had not realized that his eyes had rested on her often in admiration. "Please," he said pleadingly. Then he bent to pick up her bag, which had fallen to the floor. It was a white canvas bag, one of those expensively simple ones for which Diana had paid what to her now was nearly a month's income. Across one corner was her name, Diana in chromium. The young man handed it to her with a bow. "The name is engraved on my heart," he said. Diana laughed again. He was so absurd, and it was so long since she had laughed lightheartedly with someone as young as herself. "I must go," she said, moving on towards the lift. "Will you give me a dance tonight?" he asked. "Certainly not," she repeated. "Please," he said, "please do, Diana." She shook her head, and stepped into the lift. "Goodbye," she said demurely. "Until tonight," the young man answered incorrigibly. As the lift carried her downwards. "Diana, I must speak to you alone." Hugo took her arm and propelled her quickly and precisely through the door of the casino onto the terrace. Here he walked her swiftly away from the diners onto the dimly lit terrace overlooking the sea. "I've been trying to get to you for over an hour," he said crossly, "but I got caught up with that damn old woman." "Who on earth is she?" "My employer," Diana answered. "Your what?" "I am companion to her daughter Ruth." "Good God!" Hugo ejaculated. "But, Diana, it's impossible. You can't be, you can't. They re incredible people." "My dear Hugo," she said firmly, "what else do you expect? After all, it's not everyone who would employ me, you know." "Don't talk like that," Hugo said crossly. He took her hand in his. "Diana, darling, I've missed you so. You never answered my last letter." "Why not?" "I had nothing to say," she said simply. "I wanted to come and find you," Hugo went on, "but I felt somehow you'd like to be alone for a bit. I did call at Park Lane one day, but they had no idea where you had gone, or else you had told them not to tell me." "Everything's changed, you see," Diana said. "I've got to earn my own living, Hugo, and though this is not a particularly pleasant way, I'm not particularly competent to get a job at anything else. But such people, Diana. That woman's incredible. I couldn't get rid of her. She fastened on me like a leech. Surely you could find someone better than that." "Oh, they're not bad," Diana replied. Something in her vaguely resented Hugo's superiority about the Snivers. After all, she told herself, they were the only people who had offered her a job. "Diana, you must come away," Hugo said. "I'll find you a job, something better than this. Anyway, where we can see each other." "I am quite happy as I am," Diana returned. "Hugo offering me a job." She thought bitterly. A month ago he had been pressing her to accept a very different position. She had known from the very first that her old relationship with Hugo would never stand the test, but somehow even though she expected it, realization of how extraordinarily altered things were was bitter. Leaning over the terrace rail, with her face turned away from him, her head silhouetted in the dim light against the dark sky, she was very beautiful. Faint strains of the music came to them, mingled with the soft lap of the waves below. Hugo suddenly put out his hands and held her very close. "Diana," he said hoarsely, "darling, I've wanted you so." He kissed her passionately, and she lay quite passive in his arms, but when he released her, she turned away. Something had happened, she told herself. Hugo's kiss stirred no response in her. The old magnetism she had invariably felt at the slightest contact with him had gone. It was finished, over. The power he had always had to excite her superficially, to make her thrill to his kisses, had ended. And in that moment, feeling her hands quite steady upon the marble parapet, she felt a tremendous relief. She had been frightened of Hugo, frightened that he might hurt her, frightened that he could take even a part of her and make it his. All that had gone. It was like suddenly discovering in a nightmare that one was dreaming. Hugo was kissing her shoulder, was murmuring endearments, was trying to draw her again into his arms. She felt that he was a complete stranger, someone who mattered so little that she wondered now why she had ever troubled herself into being afraid of him, or indeed, even considering him. "Diana, I want you," he kept saying. "I want you, Diana." And suddenly Diana laughed. Laughed out loud, and turned to face him, pushing him gently away from her with both her hands against his chest. "Dear Hugo," she said, and her voice was lightly amused. "What a marvelous escape you have had." Hugo winced obviously at her frankness. "Diana, listen to me," he said. She disentangled herself and started to walk back towards the casino. "Hugo," she said, slipping her arm through his, "just for once be quite natural and see the funny side of it all because it is funny, really." She laughed again. "I don't understand you," he said. She could tell he was put out and disturbed by her attitude. "And I'm only just beginning to understand myself," she replied, and slipping through the doors in front of him. She hurried away to the roof garden on top of the casino. To her relief, Ruth was dancing, and she knew Mrs. Kniber would be happy at a baccarat table. As she stood irresolute for a moment in the doorway, a strange hand took hold of hers. "I'm glad you haven't cut my dance," said a voice, and the next moment she found herself dancing with the young man of the corridor. "Good evening," he said, looking down at her with laughing eyes. "You're looking mischievous, Diana. What poor devil has been paying for that?" "That's nearer the point than you know," Diana answered, "but I would like to point out that I did not intend to dance with you tonight." "Oh, yes you did," said her partner. "I said to myself, as I was dressing, head she comes, tail she doesn't, and it turned up heads 3 times. "Then you were cheating," Diana answered. "By the way," he continued, "my name is Terry. Irish." "In patches," he replied. He was a beautiful dancer, and Diana abandoned herself to enjoying the music and the lighthearted gaiety of her companion. She had never met anyone, she thought, who gave the impression of enjoying life more. It was not what he said, it was the mere fact that he seemed to sparkle with interest, vitality, and excitement. She came to the conclusion he was not much over 24. "Come down and have some supper," he said as the music ended. "I don't think I can," Diana replied. "I've got to look after the girl over there, with dark hair." Then, as she hesitated, she saw to her astonishment Ruth rise and join Hugo in the doorway, and as the band recommenced they started to dance. "Your offices are obviously not required," Terry said firmly, and she followed him meekly downstairs. "Hugo is dancing with Ruth," she thought amazedly. Well, Mrs. Kneiber had got her own way, and she could not resist, as they passed the gambling room, slipping in for a moment, and hurrying to where she knew she would be sitting, a pile of plaques before her, her eyes fixed unwaveringly on the cards, her hand twitching a little as she won or lost. Mrs. Kneiber was not a good gambler, but she was a very cautious one. If, however, she won a few mils, her evening was completely made for her, but she felt it was more chic to pretend that her luck at the tables was bad. However much she won, she never admitted to being anything but just about square, and Diana would often hear her moaning with her particular cronies about her bad luck at cards, while she knew that she was far too careful ever to be of benefit to the casino. Diana hurried to her side now, and said, "I'm just going to have a little supper, Mrs. Kneiber. Ruth is quite all right, she's dancing with Lord Doak." Mrs. Kneiber beamed at her. "That's good," she replied, "very good. Are you doing well?" Diana asked. "The cards are terribly against me," Mrs. Kneiber said. "I don't seem to have any luck." But her voice was not as gloomy as one might have expected, and Diana felt that her ill fortune was only pretense. She hurried back to Terry, to find he had already found her a table and ordered a bottle of champagne. As she sat opposite to him, with only a little rose-colored light between them, the stars over their heads and the waves below splashing against the floating stage, the band playing a dreamy valse, and the waiters hurrying to bring them caviar and refill their glasses, she felt she might be back again in her old life. How often in past years had she sat like this, perhaps even at this same table, laughing and talking, happy and certain that tomorrow could bring her no disagreeable surprises, would not affect her save in fleeting displeasure at some triviality, unimportant to be remembered 5 minutes after its occurrence. How absurd, Diana thought now, it was that people became annoyed over the very small things in life, were irritated by mere superficial excrescences upon the placidity of their existence. A missed train, a lame hunter, an ill-fitting dress, a forgetful servant, how often these things had spoilt hours of her life which surely should have been supremely happy. In that there was no fundamental disturbance. And yet, the strange thing was that with most people, when something really big happened, they faced it quite calmly while the little things could drive them into a frenzy. A year ago she had taken all this so much as a matter of course. Now, seeing it in a different way, she appreciated it more, because she had snatched this adventure, as it with Terry, and wanted to enjoy every moment of it. For the first time she fully enjoyed the experience of being off duty. He laughed and teased her, and criticized the people round them, until Diana found herself laughing wholeheartedly and more happily than she had for many months. "You've got a divine laugh," he told her. She smiled back at him. "And you know this is extremely improper," she said. "We pick each other up in a corridor and have supper together. It seems like the opening of a real snappy story." "I know," he retorted, "either you pinch my watch or I take your jewels." "You are welcome to them," Diana retorted, holding out her arm, which was decorated only by a glass bracelet, the type which, though chic, can be purchased for a few francs. She had not yet disposed of her jewelry, but she had been unable to afford the insurance for abroad, her year's subscription for which had expired at June quarter day. Terry laughed. "You can't have my watch, either," he said. "What have you done with it?" Diana asked. "It's in pawn, with everything else," he replied. "This is my last holiday." "Why?" she asked. "On Monday week," he replied, "I start work in earnest. Before you see the breadwinner, one of those strong, silent men who leave Golders Green every morning regularly on the 8:15, with their bowler hats square on their heads. But before I climbed onto the high stool of a bank, I determined to have one more really perfect holiday." "But why haven't you worked before?" Diana asked. "Because," he answered, "I was one of those fortunate people known to the socialist press as the idle rich. I wallowed in luxury, I was one of the moneyed classes." Diana laughed, then said seriously, "What happened?" "My fast fortune, my prospects, my inheritance, my birthright, were swallowed up in one gulp," he replied. "In other words, it went down the drain. In a crash, my dear, just a really big whopping crash." Diana had a presentiment of what she was going to hear. She knew the answer to her question, and yet she had to ask it. Which crash? She said rather faintly. The Headley crash, Terry replied, as she expected. I woke up one morning to find myself not famous, but a pauper. It's a sad, sad story, he added facetiously, and so you see from marble halls I am being driven out to earn that revolting nourishment known as bread and butter in the dusty purlieus of a city bank. He dropped his head theatrically on his hand, but this time Diana's laughter held a forced note. Another victim, she thought. She finished her supper somewhat hastily. She could not bear to think he would find out who she was. Supposing someone should come up and speak to her, she looked round, praying that there was no acquaintance in sight, and that Ruth would not come to look for her. When are you leaving here? She asked Terry. The day after tomorrow, he answered. It's damnable, isn't it, but we must meet in London. Let's make plans for tomorrow. Diana agreed with him, as she resolved to herself she would take the greatest pains to keep out of his way. She liked him so much, a boy who was prepared to face the new life courageously, finding it all a tremendous joke, and not making a single complaint at the trick fate had played him. Is this to attend me all my life? Can I never be free? She asked herself, as having thanked him for the supper she went back to find Ruth. The sins of the fathers upon the children, how invariably right the Bible was. She wondered what Terry would say if she told him who she was. She was almost tempted to go back and find out. She rather wanted to hurt herself, to find a masochistic pleasure in being an outcast and letting people know it. Waiting for her, Ruth was sitting sullen and alone. Where have you been, Diana? She said crossly. I was just coming to look for you. I'm sorry, Diana apologized. I saw you dancing with Lord Dog, and thought you wouldn't need me. That was ages ago, Ruth answered. I really don't expect to have to wait here alone, or to have to go to look for you. Diana accepted the rebuke in apologetic silence. The Snybers returned to London in about the middle of September. By that time Monte Carlo had begun to pull on all of them. The yacht had not been a success, and Ruth had been unable to find a young man. No one was therefore sorry to board the blue train one hot, stuffy afternoon and wave goodbye to the brilliant sky and sea as it puffed slowly along the coast. But back in London Ruth was as discontented as before, lying lazily in bed, spoiling her figure by eating too many rich sweets, continually querulous that they were not at a party, or being invited to houses where she wished to go. The Snybers, for all their climbing, did not receive invitations to many so-called smart parties. Diana was glad that there would be the usual crop of charity balls coming on in the winter, for which they could take 3-guinea tickets and find themselves rubbing shoulders with most of the people they wished to see and be seen with. Mary Carter had of course put Mrs. Snyber on different committees which kept the fat little woman busy day after day. She hurried from a meeting in the morning to one in the afternoon and on to a press tea, where she invited the attentions of every press photographer, so that she searched the Tatler, the Sketch and the Bystander every Tuesday evening in the hope of finding herself included amongst their society portraits. Ruth, however, was too lazy to bother to go to committee meetings. Gradually Diana came to the conclusion that Ruth was too lazy to do anything unless she were certain there would be a man present. Ruth was longing to get married. Had she been honest with herself she would have owned that a lover would supply her needs almost as well. She wanted a man, and she was finding the social round which did not provide her with one unsatisfying in every way. In reality it was a tragedy. Had the Snybers remained in their home in the north, Ruth would undoubtedly have been a great success with the men of the neighborhood. She was good-looking and she could, when she wished, be entertaining and bright. She would have enjoyed the socials, she would have easily outshone the other girls, and she could have indulged in her taste for bright cherry-colored clothes. As soon as she arrived back from the south, Diana saw Jimmy and found that he was still working at his garage and enjoying the life far more than he had anticipated. I had a bit of trouble with some of the other mechanics at first, he said. They resented my coming in as one of them, seeing that I was what they termed a toff. Things were a bit unbearable for a time, I don't mind telling you, and then I offered to knock a man's head off, just to show him, and did. After that we shook hands and became great friends, and now everything's okay. He didn't hurt you? Diana asked. I had a black eye for a fortnight which didn't improve my beauty, Jimmy answered, but luckily I knew the rules, and he didn't, although he was a far heavier chap than me. Anyway, it made matters all right, and that was the main thing. You know, Diana, he went on, this garage is expanding and I am hoping that they will let me be manager of one of their branches on a bypass. It's quite good pay, and there's no reason why I shouldn't make something of it. I can see lots of chances of improvement in the organization, but I am going a bit cautiously at first. Diana was relieved to see that he was settled so happily, but a week later she received an urgent message to meet him at once. Taking the afternoon off from the Snipers, she hurried down to the garage. "I can't get away," he said, "but I've got permission to talk to you for 10 minutes. He took her into a small, rather airless office furnished with a roll-top desk and a very inadequate electric heater. Jimmy shut the door and as Diana seated herself in the only chair, came and leant against the desk in front of her. "Look here, old girl," he said, "I'm in rather a fix. Have you got any money?" "Why?" Diana asked. "When I was up at the varsity," Jimmy explained, "I backed a bill for a girl up there. It was a damn silly thing to do, I know, but I never thought at the time that she wouldn't be able to pay it, and also, to tell the truth, Diana, I was rather in love with her. You know how one's always been told not to back bills, and not to go to the Jews for money. Anyway, there it is. I backed the bill for her, and now they've come down on me to pay. Of course I could refuse to pay and go bankrupt. But the point is, if I did my name would come out, and everyone here would know who I am. After all, I was only taken in on condition that I hid my identity. And you know I was telling you about that job as manager. Well, it was mentioned the other day, but if the whole story of who I am comes out, there's not an earthly." "How much is it?" Diana asked. £500, Jimmy answered. "That will be all right," Diana replied. "I know I can raise that on my jewelry. It is insured for lots more, but you know when it comes to selling how little one gets. I did ask a jeweler to make me an offer on my ring some weeks ago, when I was having it repaired, and he said that it was worth £200, so we can easily get the rest." "Those sapphire earrings of yours are worth a lot. I know what father paid for them," Jimmy said. "I'm afraid they've gone," Diana said, and she told him what had happened to her a week before. She had gone with the Snipers to a charity ball. The tickets were not expensive, and the crowd was tremendous. They had not enjoyed themselves very much, for Mrs. Sniper criticized all the guests, and saw few people she knew. Finally, bored and disappointed, immediately the cabaret was finished they decided to go home. Both Mrs. Sniper and Ruth gave the tickets for the cloaks to Diana, and asked her to get them for them. There was rather a crowd in the cloakroom, but knowing how much Mrs. Sniper disliked being kept waiting, she pushed her way hastily through the waiting women and did her best to get in front and procure the cloaks out of turn. A thin woman in a hectic shade of salmon pink, who had obviously supped unwisely and too well, tried to stop her. "I was here before you," she said offensively. She slapped her ticket down on the attendant's table, and then she peered more closely at Diana's face. "It's Miss Headley, isn't it?" she said, "Miss Diana Headley. Well, I'd just like to tell you what I think of your crooked father. Where's all my money, I'd like to know, that I put into his company? It's gone, and a fat lot. You seem to care, I must say, that he's stolen our money coming in here, pushing yourself in front of honest people, covered in jewelry, too, which I dare say my money has paid for." Diana was wearing a dark blue frock that night, and to match it she had put on the large, beautifully set sapphire earrings which her father had given her many years before. They were unusually fine sapphires, and large enough, as they swung from her ears, to attract admiring attention. The woman in salmon pink, working herself into hysterical anger, pointed at them now. "They cost a pretty penny," she said, "paid for with my money." Other people in the cloakroom began to cluster round, to hear what was being said. Without saying a word, Diana unscrewed the earrings from her ears and placed them in the hands of the astonished woman. Then she took the cloaks from the attendant and walked out of the room. All the way home she sat trembling, shaken by the indignity of the scene, quite glad that she had given away her earrings, feeling that at least one of her father's creditors could say nothing more against him. She had not worn any of the rest of her jewelry again, and somehow she felt glad now that what was left could go towards helping Jimmy. She took it next day to the family jeweler, from whom her father had bought her first child's bracelet of tiny pearls, and her 21st birthday bracelet of diamonds and sapphires. The only thing she kept was her mother's engagement ring, a half-hoop of diamonds set in gold. When Jimmy gets married, she thought, I'll give it to him for his wife. To her delight, the jewelry fetched nearly £700, and she sent £600 to Jimmy, proposing that they should split the extra £200 between them. He sent her the £100 back, with a sweet letter thanking her for helping him and adding, "One good thing which has come out of all this trouble, Diana, is that I have realized what a very wonderful sister I've got. It's very comforting to me to know that you are there, and I hope you will always feel the same about me. Whatever happens in the future, we rise or fall together." His letter brought tears to Diana's eyes. He was right, it was marvelous to feel one had a companion in one's misfortunes. Now she was back in London she had begun to feel lonely again. And one thing had happened which hurt her more than anything else. Ruth wanted to go to dance at Quaglino's one night, and accordingly 2 men were produced, and after a sumptuous dinner the 4 of them went off alone. The restaurant was gay and amusing, the decorations particularly becoming to Diana in her plain green dress and little velvet cape. The music got into her toes. She wanted to dance, she felt young, she felt gay when suddenly she looked up to see Terry in the doorway. Delightedly, and without thinking, she smiled at him and waved. He returned her salutation with a stiff, formal bow. For a moment she stared at him incredulously, and then she realized what had happened. He knew who she was. All the gaiety and happiness she had felt slipped away from her. It was no use, she told herself. She was outside, the Eden of forgetfulness was barred, and what had happened was like the falling of a sword on her. She was cut off. She sat silent and miserable, then a voice called her name, and asked Ruth's permission to join their party. It was Hugo. To her surprise he came and sat down with them, and made himself very charming not only to her but to Ruth, who responded eagerly, giggling and blushing, and leaning towards him across the table, fearful of missing anything he might say. Diana had never seen him exert himself to be more pleasant, and under his influence she gradually began to feel a little happier. Presently Ruth rose to dance, and she was able to speak to him unheard by the other members of the party. "Why, Hugo?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. "Why am I here?" he asked. "I'll tell you. Because I must see you, I've got to see you, Diana. You were beastly to me at Monte Carlo, but I can't get you out of my mind. Will you meet me tomorrow?" Diana shook her head. "I'm a working woman," she said. "Very well," he said firmly, "I shall ring up Mama and ask myself to dinner." "You can't, Hugo," Diana said laughing. "You'd never stick it." "Won't I?" said Hugo determinedly. "You see, before you know where you are, I shall be staying with the Schneibers as one of the family. When you do that, I'll really believe you're fond of me," Diana said, mockingly. "If you don't believe it now," Hugo said very seriously, "you are being very silly." "But I always have been," Diana said lightly. Diana settled into her life at the Schneibers. She grew used to being ordered about, to being subservient, and her life of the past seemed now a vague dream. She did not long for the old days, any more than her memories of them made her feel unhappy. All the things of the past seemed to have vanished so utterly that it was difficult even to herself to recall them vividly to her mind. Lolia Standish noticed the change in Diana, and she was overwhelmingly glad, but she was also surprised. "It just shows," she said to her husband, "how you should never judge anyone as frivolous until they have been tested. I grant you that I did not believe, even though I love Diana, that she could stand up so well against such an ordeal. It is amazing the courage which is given to us all to face our difficulties, whatever they may be. When we want it, it is there, and we have only to demand it. It is true that every man can be a hero when the opportunity comes." To him, Jack Standish nodded. "You're right," he said, "and secretly I apologize to Diana for all the unkind things I have thought about her. The funny thing is," he added, "that she looks happier. That supercilious air which always irritated me has gone. I wonder what Barry would think of her. I wonder." Diana had begged a weekend holiday to go down to Huntsman's house. Lolia and Jack had invited her continually, but until now she had been unable to escape from her duties. Finally Ruth had retired to bed with a cold in her head, and had announced her intention of sleeping it off from Friday till Monday. Diana knew that this meant that she would lie with the latest new novel in her hands, a box of chocolates by her side, and the wireless blaring in her ear. Accordingly, she seized the opportunity to go to Worcestershire. Permission was given her grudgingly, but nevertheless it was given, and she thought she had never felt so thrilled about anything as the thought of seeing Jack and Lolia again, and being a free person for 2 whole days. "I could kiss the engine driver, I could hug the guard," she thought as she hurried on to Paddington Station. Several of the passengers looked at the tall, smiling girl who hurried along the platform to the front portion of the train, as though the nearer the engine the nearer she was to her destination. She did not think of her sad feelings the last time she had traveled on this line, or of her return. Instead she was anticipating the joy of seeing her friends again, of being at Huntsman's house, and of the luxury of not being dependent on somebody's whim. At Malevolern Station the car awaited her, and she arrived at the house to find tea, presided over by Lolia, in the huge oak-paneled hall. It was like coming home, the welcoming bark of the dogs, the servants' respectful greetings, Lolia's outstretched arms, and Jack's warm handshake, and quite suddenly the tears came into Diana's eyes. Before she could stop them, they brimmed over. "Oh, darlings," she said. "I'm so happy." Seizing a small Cairn terrier in her arms, she put her cheek against his rough coat. "Don't take any notice of me," she said to Lolia, "I'm a fool. But you don't know how glad I am to see you." "Or how glad we are to see you, my dear," Lolia said in her soft voice, putting out her hand to her. "Tell us about yourself." And so Diana told them what she had been doing since they last met, and as she recounted the story of the past months, the difficulties, the grumbling of the discontented Ruth, the snobbery of Mrs. Sknyber and the whole household, she suddenly saw the funny side, so that she told her story as if every difficulty had been a tremendous joke. She was neither spiteful nor cantankerous, but merely exquisitely humorous about them, caricaturing her employers with just that twist of good-humored portraiture which is permissible, even about our greatest friends or our dearest enemies. Jack and Lolia laughed and laughed as under Diana's recounting the Sknyber family came to life for them. They saw Mrs. Sknyber struggling at Monte Carlo against the nausea of seasickness, so that she could be photographed at the helm of the yacht. They saw Ruth, visiting every doctor in London in search of slimming cures, and yielding immediately to the temptation of boxes of chocolates, which doubled any weight she had perspiringly lost. They heard of the butler, majestic in his appointments, contemptuous in his employers, reading Kelly's handbook in the pantry, and being polite only to those of the Sknybers' guests whom he considered of good family. They, with Diana, realized the pathos of Mr. Sknyber's struggle, day after day, to make more and more money, to have it poured away on the entertainment of people who despised him. Diana had never before known that she could be amusing without being definitely unkind. She was not unkind about the Sknybers, because underneath it all she liked them. She saw their faults, she saw their failings, and yet the tragedy of their aspirations was becoming more and more apparent to her every day. In London, when her own acquaintances came to the house, she discouraged any discussion of their hosts and her employers. There was something within her nowadays which made her ashamed of that easy method of behavior, which took hospitality as a matter of course, and gave in return not even the courtesy of good manners. She knew that if she had wished, she could have obtained a lot of cheap sympathy, and yet this was the first time she had discussed her position with anyone. And now, as she told her story, she liked it for being a joke, for being amusing. Why haven't I realized this before? She thought suddenly. Why haven't I been conscious of how amusing the whole thing is? Then she said to Lolia. It is a joke, isn't it? The whole ménage. And, what's more, I'm enjoying it. And she knew that she spoke the truth. When tea was over, Lolia went up to the nursery to say good night to her son. Diana sat in front of the open fireplace, half dreaming, thinking a little, half asleep in the warmth of the huge logs. Outside it was already dark, and the butler as he took away the tea things switched on the soft shaded lights. There was an atmosphere of coziness and warmth at Huntsman's house, and an atmosphere of happiness, for no one could come in contact with Lolia and Jack without being affected by their own happy harmony. All emotions are infectious, and now Diana lay back peacefully, her head against the sofa, her legs stretched out on the warm fur rug, while the terrier pressed his nose against her hand, and a Great Dane watched her with half-shut eyes. Dreamily she heard a car drive up outside, and then suddenly the door opened, and a man stood there, pausing a moment before he saw her. Because she was not sure whether or not she was pleased to see him, the blood coursed into her cheeks, and she sat up with a little exclamation. And as she hesitated, half rising, an uncertain smile on her face, Barry cried out her name in surprise, and walked towards her with outstretched hands. Why didn't you tell me Barry was coming this weekend? Diana asked Lolia next day, as leaning over the rails of the paddock they watched the two men taking young ponies over some jumps. I wasn't quite certain that he was, Lolia said. You know Barry treats this as his home. He comes and goes as he pleases. Jack and I have now given him 2 rooms in the West Wing, which are kept exclusively for him. We never give them to other guests, or move any of his things from there. So he announces his arrival by coming himself. We love having him, and, apart from anything else, I know that seeing him keeps Jack happy. You know, Diana, she said simply, it's very difficult for a woman when she loves a man very much to prevent herself feeling that she is stopping him from enjoying the freedom he had before marriage. Jack and Barry were so much together, and I know that at times Jack longs to be off on one of these wild expeditions with him. Of course he can't and doesn't leave me, but I know that he would like to go, to travel, to explore, to wander more or less where chance might take them. I'm not saying Jack regrets for one moment our marriage. He's too happy for that, and after all, we have Robin. But he wouldn't be human if just at times he didn't feel the call of the open road, long for the adventure, for the freedom. He knows that he is doing good work at home, but at times it must seem to him that Barry has the better part. And so anything I can do to make the bonds, however loving they are, seem lighter, well, I do it. How clever you are, Diana said impulsively. If I ever have a husband, which sometimes I doubt, I shall never be as clever as you are, Lolia. I'm not really clever, Lolia answered. I just love Jack more than anything in the world, and if you love somebody tremendously, really love them in the real meaning of the word, you want to give and go on giving. I suppose all women feel that, as if they would like to tear a chunk of themselves off and sacrifice it for the person they love. Do you think men feel that for women? Diana asked. Yes, to a certain extent, Lolia said. The man's attitude towards the woman he loves must be that of protection. He must protect her not only from worldly harm but also from himself. Can you understand what I am trying to say? It is the unselfishness on both sides, an unselfishness which is entirely spontaneous because it is only love which can really make for happiness. Never tell me that a man who can in any way injure a woman's reputation or defame her name can love her. No woman needs a chaperone from true love, no girl need be protected from a man who really and truly loves her. The whole truth lies in the fact that whoever loves another seeks the best for them, not for themselves. Diana was silent, watching the superb horsemanship of the two men and thinking of what Lolia had said. It was a bright day, with a touch of frost in the air, and a cold wind which blew from the hills, whistling round the house and through the surrounding woods. High above their heads 3 ducks flew in formation, wheeling round and round above the lake before they finally settled. The dogs were barking and chasing each other round the park. Barry, bareheaded in the sunshine, was schooling his pony admirably, taking him over the jumps as only a skilled horseman can, calling forth praise from the old groom who stood by. 105. Silence between them. Barry looks well on a horse, Lolia said, breaking the. Diana nodded. She was looking at Barry with new eyes today. Reserved, stern, critical, almost superhuman, his image had grown up in her mind. Her thoughts of him had made him into a man quite out of the ordinary, beyond her comprehension, and beyond any of the kindliness and gentleness which makes human beings really lovable. And then last night she had seen him in a different guise, and understood him more. After his arrival they had gone upstairs to seek for Lolia, and found her in the nursery. Robin's cry of welcome had shown that he for one did not find Barry formidable. Then, with a delightful lack of self-consciousness, without a thought for anyone else but Robin, Barry had romped with the child, until nurse had interfered and car-ride him protesting to bed. Diana had seen not the great intellectual traveler but a flushed-faced, tousled-haired man who played with an adoring small boy. He had been buried under cushions, skirmished with as a ferocious bear, ridden pick-a-back as a champing steed, and suddenly she had realized that Barry was not so incomprehensible as she had imagined. The human mind is too apt to put on a pedestal anyone a little out of the ordinary. Diana in the past months had gradually begun to think of Barry as a kind of deified critic, someone who could not experience the normal simple emotions of an everyday man. In fact, she had ceased to think of him as a man. He had given her courage, he had guided her and invigorated her with new hope. He seemed to her like a priest of some new, but real religion, to whom she could go, sure of finding comfort and fresh strength. And so, when she saw him again, it was almost a shock to realize that he was a man and an attractive man. She had never known him so gay before. He had laughed and teased her at dinner, while Lolia and Jack had encouraged them to argue, spurring them on to cross swords with each other, laughing, both of them, Diana and Barry, unlike their usual Celavels. He's nice, Diana told herself as she watched him now on the pony. He was laughing, and she noticed how it changed the severe lines on his face, making him look younger. She began to understand that the reserve which had frightened her, perhaps at first antagonized her, was due to his spending so much of his life alone. For months Barry might be by himself in the world, with only his native servants. Tell me about Barry, she said to Lolia. Who is he? Why did he ever start what he's doing now? His father, Lolia answered, was an officer in the Indian Army, and his mother was one of the most beautiful women of her generation. Barry was born in India, and then, as usual, he was sent back to England. It is the tragedy of the Anglo-Indian child. A few years after that, his mother, whom he adored, ran away with a subaltern in her husband's regiment. Barry's father was completely broken-hearted, but it made him hide his feelings under the most terrifying reserve. He spoke about his unhappiness to no one. In those days, divorce was considered improper and sinful. Barry's father was a strict churchman, he refused to divorce his wife. For years the tragedy went on working itself out. The subaltern, of course, had to leave the regiment, and he could not come home and live openly with a woman who was not his wife. Finally they went east, and they were killed not so very many years ago in an earthquake in Tokyo. Then Barry knew his mother. Diana said. He knew her, yes, Lolia answered, but it was all terribly sad. You see, she was a strong character in her own way. If she cared for somebody, she cared for them regardless of place and circumstances, or any opposition. I don't think she could ever have cared very deeply for Barry's father, but she did love the man she eloped with. However, he could not stand up against the disgrace, and I think he always regretted the loss of his commission. Anyway, he treated her very badly, mentally and physically, he was really brutal to her, and yet she loved him. Through it all, whatever he did to her, whatever happened, she still loved him. Barry will never talk about it, but other people who knew her have, of course, discussed it with us, knowing what friends Jack and Barry are. Barry's people tried to do something. They begged his mother to leave the man, but she refused. I think in her own way, in spite of everything, she found happiness. Perhaps it is better to live dangerously than not to live at all. Anyway, that was her life, she chose it and she stuck to it through thick and thin. Barry's father became governor of one of the smaller provinces in India. Immediately he left school, Barry spent a good deal of time out there. He would have spent more, only the war came, but it did not take him from India before he had grown to understand and to love the country. His real education came in those years before the war, which he spent with his father. He took the trouble, which few Englishmen do, really to understand the conditions of the people he governed, to interest himself in their point of view, to try as well as he was able to understand the workings of the Oriental mind. That was the time when Barry met one of the great Indian philosophers of the century. He was an old man then, he is dead now, but if ever a teacher gained a true disciple, he did in Barry. He inspired the boy with the idea of finding and bringing to the West some of the profound ideas of the East. And his father? Diana asked. He died 3 years after the war was over. He was immensely respected, he did exceedingly well for his country, and I think that he adored his only child, but his troubles had embittered him, so that he never showed tenderness or affection to his son. That is, I think, what accounts for Barry's almost unnatural self-control. From the time he was a little boy nobody loved him. He did not see his mother, you understand, until he was grown up, and then only very, very occasionally. I think Barry is afraid of love now. All his life he has seen it, so far as he is concerned, in its most destructive form. He has been warned against it, his father did his best to make him immune to it. Of course he is attractive to women, but few women attract him. As she spoke, Barry rode up to them. What are you two talking about so seriously? He asked. Diana smiled. You'd be surprised if you knew. He laughed. Then it's obviously myself. There's many a true word spoken in jest, Lolia and sweared. It's lunchtime. Diana must be starving. Tell Jack he's to come in. Barry galloped away at her command, and a minute or two later the men joined them. Jack slipped an arm through his wife's. Cold, darling, he said. You ought to have been writing yourself. She shook her head. They strolled towards the house, whistling for the dogs, who had gone off rabbiting. Why don't you come out for a ride tomorrow morning? Barry asked Diana. I haven't any clothes here, she answered. You can have mine, Lolia said. We're about the same size, and I know our boots fit, because do you remember I borrowed yours some time ago in London, when Jack would insist on my trying the new hunter before he finally bought him? Oh, yes, I remember, Diana said. Well, I'd love to ride tomorrow, if it's no trouble. That's splendid, said Barry. We'll go up over the hills, there's a mile of straight on the Hereford side, which you will enjoy. What shall we do this afternoon? Lolia asked. We haven't any plans. What do you think, Barry? I've got some work, he said, I really must get on with. Walk up as far as the castle with me, and I'll show you the first chapters of Jack's and my new publication. I've still got half the proofs to finish. They set off soon after luncheon, as Barry had suggested. The wind whipped the color into Diana's cheeks, and made her glad of the protection of her Jaeger coat. Thank goodness, she thought as she put it on, country clothes don't alter in fashion. She was already finding the problem of buying new clothes rather difficult. The party walked briskly, talking gaily, towards the castle. They came up the steep approach to where Diana had sat on the fallen tree trunk that summer's day some months ago, when Barry had surprised her and then brought her comfort. She knew that he had never mentioned their meeting to Lolia and Jack, and as they passed the place now she turned and smiled at him in secret understanding. Barry's eyes met hers, and he smiled back. Well done, he said softly. When they got back, Diana lay luxuriously in a hot bath, letting the heat soak the stiffness from her limbs. She had come in from a ride with Barry feeling gloriously alive, having enjoyed every moment of their gallop. She had liked the wind in her face, the thud of the horse's hoofs, and the feeling of a horse beneath her, the strain of the reins against her unaccustomed fingers. She had liked Barry's companionship too, and the admiration he had shown as she controlled her high-spirited animal. The 2 hours they had spent together had passed for her all too quickly. They had talked, and the memory of their conversation came to her now, as she lay seeing her body hazily pink through the bath water slightly tinted by the scented bath salts. They had climbed the hill, and it had seemed to Diana that never before had she wanted to feel so much, and enjoy every moment of what was happening. She wanted to think clearly, to be able to understand and perhaps to be able to express in words to Barry what her thoughts were, and ask his opinion of them. The morning was so lovely, the sunshine, the wind, the sky steely blue above their heads, the leafless trees pointing upwards dark skeleton fingers, as in an etching. Diana had a feeling that it was all too tremendous for her to understand, her good health, the beauty around her, the happiness which seemed to well up from her very being. If only one could explain this, she thought, if only we could give it to those we love as a present. She thought of Jimmy in London, working, for she knew that the weekends were the busiest time at the garage. If only she could send him a parcel containing this moment. And as if he understood a little of what she was thinking, Barry did not talk to her, but they rode in silence for some time. Only after a long gallop, when they reined in their horses and sat, flushed, to look at the magnificent view over Hereford towards the Welsh hills, did they really begin to talk. Then, speaking in words which carried something deeper than their mere surface meaning, Barry and Diana returned home. How kind he was, she thought now, how different when one knew him from how she had envisaged him at first. Then suddenly, as she lay there in her bath, she realized that she loved him. "I love him," she whispered. It was something she had never experienced before, because it carried with her emotion a tremendous reliance, an overwhelming respect. So often when she had been infatuated with some man, even while he attracted her underneath what was, after all, a mere physical mechanism, she utterly despised him. Even when she had grown fond of someone, she always heard that cold, calculating voice of her brain, telling her it would not last. And now, for the first time, she had met someone who was so big that she could not criticize him, and she loved him because he was himself. It seemed to her now, at this moment, that there had never been a time in her acquaintance of him when she had not loved him. She tried to remember her angry feelings when they had first met, but they had evaporated. All she could feel was an overwhelming desire to be near him again, to hear his voice, to watch him move. For the moment she did not even desire a closer contact with him, all she wanted was to be near him. She felt herself to be like Robin, and the dogs, who moved close beside him whenever he appeared, happy just to touch him, grateful for his presence. Does everyone feel like this, she wondered, when they are in love? Did everyone experience this joy, this unreasoning happiness, which swept over one like a flood, carrying every reserve, every inhibition, before it? And then came the question to her mind, would he ever love her? She thought of his life as Lolia had told her about it the day before. He knew very little about love, unless Lolia was mistaken. He had lived among the sterner things of life, as Diana had lived her life among the more frivolous, and neither of them had as yet been carried away by that emotion which escapes human control. Diana had promised herself that whatever he suggested, herself knowledgeable of life and men. Had she really thought seriously of marrying Hugo? Had she really believed that she would never experience this thrilling happiness, this feeling within herself that she was on the threshold of something too wonderful to be contemplated or put into words? She looked at herself in the glass at the end of the bath. Was this herself, who had once found life unbearably dull, who had once thought miserably of tomorrow? Whatever tomorrow held now for her, she knew that she was waiting for it, thrillingly, tremulously alive. I can't wait, Diana thought suddenly. I want Barry and I want him now. To wait may mean that I shall lose him. Like and subscribe.